Taxation. Pitfalls and considerations when doing business in new markets.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today we'll be speaking about taxation and what we need to look at when we enter new markets. And we are very lucky to have with us Amit Kumar Baid from Mumbai. He flew from Mumbai to attend this conference. And Teresa Meyer from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Again, she flew from Brazil for this conference. So thank you very much for being with us. Both India and Brazil are hot topics. So we have clients asking us about how to structure in Brazil, how to structure in India. We're seeing lots and lots of interest. Before we go into the taxation, if you can tell me why Brazil and why India? What are operators looking for and why are they actually coming in your countries? Maybe, Amit, you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Ramona. India. I would say India today can be considered as the epicenter of the global gaming explosion which is happening across the world. Reasons could be many. Huge population, young population, low data bandwidth costs, and a significant gamers or a gaming population. Just to elaborate this a bit more, India today ranks first with 1.45 billion population across the world. It has surpassed China. But nonetheless, 50% of the Indian population is below the age of 25. 65% of the Indian population is below the age of 35. India had 420 million gamers, online gamers, by 2023. It is expected to be 450 million by the end of this year. The data bandwidth costs in India are the lowest in the world. It is around 10 cents per GB. Global giants like Google, Microsoft, Tencent are already heavily invested in the Indian gaming economy. So I would say just one thing, let's dive into the diversity of India.
A bigger market than Malta, I would say, much bigger market than Malta. Teresa, Brazil, why Brazil? There's so much, it's a very hot topic at the moment.
Honestly, to keep it very simple, we are the third biggest market in bets nowadays. So since it became legal in 2018, it's growing so fast. We are just behind the US and UK right now. And we are not as big as India, but we are still a very, very big population. Data has shown that 30% of the people between the age of 16 and 24 has already been in contact to bet somehow in Brazil.
And again, before going into the tax, so how to structure and what to structure, briefly on the regulatory side. So what is permissible so far in Brazil and in India, and what is in the pipeline from a gambling point of view and gaming?
Sure. So what can be done in India? Casual games, video games, fully permissible for all ages. Fantasy sports, skill-based, permissible. Real money games, again skill-based, permissible. Casinos, 2 states in India have allowed casinos, Goa and Sikkim. The others have restricted it. Online casinos are yet being deliberated. Blockchain, NFT, permissible. So broadly speaking, anything related to games, fantasy sports, to the extent it is skill-based, it is allowed. What is restricted is gambling, betting on Indian sports leagues. And from a regulation perspective, India also has a very controlled foreign direct investment, whereby foreign investments into gambling and betting is restricted, but others are allowed. Further, investments into India from countries like China, which shares land borders with India, has to be approved These approvals take around 8 to 10 months. But we have ways whereby this can be structured in different ways so that these land border issues are not there. And yes, again, advertisement is regulated to protect the interest of minors and the financial interest of the gamers.
What about Brazil? What can be done in Brazil so far?
To keep a brief framework, Brazil, from 2018, the bets got legal, sports bet, fantasy sports as well, but only sports bet, like online sports and sports on real life events, right? That's what we have so far. And when it comes to regulations, we do have restrictions on advertising and some other regulations. But what is important for the tax perspective, we have two main issues, which are capital requirement and ownership requirement. So you need to put paid in some amount of cash to have a license in Brazil that amounts up to 30 million reais, which is about 4.5 million euros, and ownership requirement, which says that directly or indirectly, a Brazilian has to own 20% of the shares of the operator in Brazil.
This is interesting, and you even mentioned it, Amit. So, from the gaming investors investing in Brazil, they would need to have a partner, a local partner in Brazil. And Amit, you mentioned that in India, it's also restricted to have foreigners investing directly in India when it comes to investment. So, do they need local partners in India, or how does it work?
No, local partners are not required. 100% investment is permissible by foreign entities to the extent they are not involved in gambling and betting.
But if they want to, so at the moment it's not open to gambling and betting?
Yes.
Okay. And in Brazil, we always require the
ownership requirement.
The ownership requirement.
Yeah. It says actually Brazilian nationals, it's not restricted to residents. That's
okay, so any individuals who moves to Brazil can be a partner in this situation?
So the law provides for Brazilians as nationals. If you are a Maltese and you decide to be a tax resident in Brazil, you still have to have a Brazilian ownership of 20% on based on nationality.
So moving to Brazil is not a...
Apparently it's not.
No. In terms of structuring, so how is it best to structure in your jurisdictions? Is it through companies, partnerships, in the form of holding companies, trading? How is the most efficient way how to structure, keeping in mind, so entry, the investments coming from Europe or from any other countries, and also exit. So if potentially the businesses are about to be sold, how is the most efficient structure, how to structure in your countries? Maybe Teresa, you want to go?
So at entry level, a partnership could be interesting with the Brazilian, because since you have the ownership requirement, what we've seen is some joint venturings happen in Brazil. You do have to have a physical presence in Brazil in order to have the license, right? And since you have the capital requirement, you do have to put some equity into Brazil, which is not a bad thing because dividends are currently exempt, either for residents or non-residents. So the remuneration of the capital you invest in Brazil is exempt, right? Debt is also an option. The interests are not exempt. You have 15% rate if you are in a regular jurisdictions and 25% if you're in blacklisted jurisdictions according to...
And Brazil has its own list of blacklisted jurisdictions.
It does.
Maybe you can mention some of them?
So Malta is not one of the blacklisted jurisdictions. We have the most common ones, which would be BVI, Cayman, Mauritius. The list, it has a straightforward idea behind it, which is what tax up to 17% max of the corporate statutory income rate would be deemed as a tax haven for Brazilian purposes.
So if it is an injection, it's financing by debt and there's interest and they're blacklisted, then the withholding tax is higher.
It's higher. It goes higher. It goes up to 25%. And then you have transfer pricing, regardless on whether it's a related party or not, if you are in a tax haven. Yeah.
Okay. And if you invest with capital injections, is there any particular...
There are no problem, because dividends are exempt regardless of wherever you are.
Okay. What about in India? So is it best to structure through companies, partnerships? And how is it the best way how to finance the companies?
So in India, a private limited company, PLC, could be a best approach to start with. There can be limited liability companies as well. And when it comes to tax structuring for these companies for the foreign investments entering into India, Indian tax authorities over the last 5 to 10 years, they have completely disliking treaty shopping. They treat any sort of treaty shopping as a tax abuse and they attack those structures. So any of the treaties which are being explored, where an entity has substance in the form of employees, capital, assets, business, those jurisdictions could be explored, and if because of substance and a benefit is available, that is being allowed. These corporates are taxed at 25% approximately at the corporate tax rate. And India also has a withholding tax regime whereby any payment by this corporate is subject to tax withholding, whether it is to resident or non-resident. So when these corporate entities pay their winnings or make any payment to, let's say, a winner or a person who has bet, those are subject to withholding tax at the rate of 30%. 30.
But what are these services which are subject to withholding tax? Is it any payment which is subject to withholding tax? So maybe you can give examples of...
So it's any sort of payment is subject to withholding tax, whether it is royalty, whether it is fees for technical services, or even including rent payments to an Indian landlord.
And is it cross-border or even local?
It's both, local as well as cross-border.
And on top of that, would there be also GST?
Yes. India, GST on the gaming industry is a bit harsh. It is evolving because the rules have changed quite recently. The GST rate is 28%, but it's not only the high tax rate. What is the issue mainly is that the GST is on the amount of deposits made or the bets placed. It's not on the winnings. So for example, if someone is placing a deposit or a bet of 100 euros, 28% of that, which is 28 euros, directly goes as GST to the government.
Okay. Teresa, what about in Brazil? So the standard corporate tax rate and withholding taxes. I know that there is an issue with withholding taxes in Brazil. So how does that work?
So we have a corporate income tax at 34%, which is pretty high. And we do not have withholdings within Brazil. We do have some kind of VAT, which it's completely changing in a bit in 2027, and we don't even know what would be the statutory rate for that. We also have taxes on gross revenue, but these ones are being kicked out with the tax reform. So this is so nowadays all we have it's a 4.25% on taxes on gross revenue of a company with some kind of credit system, but it's still a lot. And this is we are not having that anymore, and we are going towards a more simplified VAT kind of system in the future.
Yeah. So this point of withholding tax is very important.
Yeah.
we've seen operators which have their B2Bs in Malta or B2Bs in Europe and providing the service to Brazil.
Yeah,
And there we've seen a huge problem with withholding taxes.
exactly.
And Brazil, correct me if I'm not, there aren't a lot of double taxation treaties, so relief for double taxation is a bit difficult. So what we were suggesting our clients setting up in Brazil was that it would be better to have their B2B or the software providers based in Brazil in order to avoid this withholding tax.
So there are two issues when it comes to cross-border in Brazil, right? It's the IP allocation. So we tax heavily with withholding some kind of different taxes if the IP is outside of Brazil, and you have to remunerate on that, and also services. And they can be combined, which is the worst case scenario, and the taxes go as high as 40% on different taxes. And our tax treaty network goes as high as 40 tax treaties, which is not a lot for Brazil, and for a country the size of Brazil. And just withholding taxes, as it's covered by the tax treaties, it represents 15% over this 40%. So these can be managed by tax treaties, but the other parts, which are also affected by the tax reform that is coming, but as of now, 15% is manageable. The rest, if it's considered like a software as a service, for instance, which is both, which the tax authorities in Brazil consider both a service and royalty remuneration, the taxes can go as high as 40% if it's allocated outside of Brazil.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was referring to.
Yeah.
So most of our clients were suggesting that if you consider setting up in Brazil and you have this technology, rather than invoicing from Europe to Brazil, it would be beneficial if the technology moves to Brazil, or part of the technology moves to Brazil. What about when it comes to taking money out of India and Brazil? So dividends, is there any withholding taxes on dividends distribution upwards? How does it work?
Yes, India has a withholding tax on dividend. Dividends are taxable. The tax rate could vary between 10% to 20% depending on the jurisdiction. And India also has a capital gains tax. So if any sale of shares by a foreign investor is subject to capital gain tax, the rate depends on the period of holding. But one of the important and I would say an interesting measure which Indian government has taken over the years is that it's not only sale of Indian shares which could be subject to tax, it's an indirect sale of Indian entity whereby the foreign parent is sold and nothing is touched in India. That could also be in certain circumstances taxable in India.
And I was going to ask this question. So if you have, for example, a Malta holding and an Indian subsidiary, and the shareholders on top of the Malta holding sell, so the Maltese company sells the Indian subsidiary, how does that work? So what you were saying, that it's indirectly, it's still subject to tax?
So let's take an example. Malta holding company is holding the Indian subsidiary. The shareholders are now selling the shares of the Malta holding company.
Yeah.
Even in that circumstance, there could be an Indian capital gain tax if the Malta holding company derives 50% of its value from Indian subsidiary.
But does it make a difference if there is substance in the other country, or you decide to tax it anyway?
This is irrespective of having substance. This is not an anti-abuse measure. The Indian government says that this is an indirect way of selling Indian businesses, which is a capital asset in India, and hence it should be taxed in India. It's very similar to China and Australia.
But it depends on the double taxation treaties as well, no?
Yeah.
For relief.
That's true.
What about you, Teresa? Do you have such strict rules when it comes to capital gains?
We tax capital gains, like direct investment in capital gains, but we do So indirect capital gains, where you're mentioning, we don't have a rule for that, but there are tax assessments that says that if the underlying asset is a Brazilian asset, and the term is asset, you can understand whatever you want, but if the underlying main asset is Brazilian, then you might have to be taxed capital gains in Brazil over those selling assets.
So how would it be best to structure from a capital gain? Is having a Brazilian holding company on top would help?
So there is, if there is a Brazilian holding company, the good thing is we have a tax benefit on the goodwill, so we can acquire the company by a holding company in Brazil and then merge the target into Brazil, and you have somehow of a 34% tax benefit on the only on the goodwill part of the purchase price.
Okay, we're running out of time. I hope that this gave you a flavor of what you need to look at when it comes to both India and Brazil. Hopefully in the coming Sigma event, we'll be discussing consolidation, because from experience that's what happened. First, lots of operators will set up in your countries, and then there will be lots of consolidation, and we would need to talk about taxation and mergers and acquisitions in your country then. Thank you very much for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Ramona and to her panel for that very informative discussion.